We're on chapter 16 in our study, and if all goes well, this morning we'll be catching up to where we left off in the history of the Northern Kingdom today. So, it's Second Chronicles is where we'll be. So we read last week about Joash, who was a phenomenal king, at least in regard to what he did, as long as his uncle and foster father was alive, Jehoiada the priest. But after Jehoiada's death, Joash himself believed some lies, went off the deep end, started allowing idolatry and persecuting those who disagreed with him. Amaziah came after him and wasn't particularly good. He made an attempt to keep God's law, at least near the beginning of his reign, but after he conquered the Edomites, he began to worship their gods and turned away from God near the end of his reign as well. And because of a situation involving mercenaries that he had hired from the Northern Kingdom, who he had to send back, and who attacked people throughout the kingdom of Judah on their way. In retaliation for that, he went against the Northern Kingdom, which at that time was much stronger than him, and suffered a rather horrible defeat at their hands. So a bit of a failure overall as reigns went. And down in 2 Chronicles 25, at the very end of chapter 25, where we ended last week. In verse 27 of 25. It says, "Now from the time that Amaziah turned away from following Yahweh, they conspired against him in Jerusalem. And he fled to Lachish, and they sent after him to Lachish and put him to death there. Then they carried him on horses and buried him with his fathers in the city of Judah." So apparently a segment of the society that disagreed with his policies, that in its own eyes was doing a good thing, assassinated Amaziah. And he was buried with his fathers, with the kings. At the end of each of these reigns, we're seeing where what happened to these kings after they died, and it's kind of an indication of the people's recognition of whether they were a good king or bad king. And their faithfulness to Yahweh seems to be a key factor in that. There was a large portion of the nation throughout this time that recognized the importance of staying true to God. But of course, through all of this, there was a strong element that wanted to bring back idolatry, that wanted to be more eclectic in their worship. So whichever king was in charge, they always had some people willing to follow them and on their side. The nation was divided. And it became more divided. As we go on from this point, we're going to see a fluctuation. There's going to be good kings and bad kings, and they're going to alternate, and every good king is going to be better, typically, and every bad king is going to be worse until the very end when things fall apart. So the nation is definitely coming to a point of crisis spiritually. But after Amaziah, we have Uzziah. And his name is probably most familiar to us because of Isaiah. Isaiah's famous vision in the year that King Uzziah died is when he saw the Lord seated on his throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple with glory. We're not to Uzziah's death yet, but at the start of his reign. Let's read chapter 26, verses 3 through 8. Uzziah was 16 years old when he became king, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem. So over half a century, a very good long reign. He reigned 52 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. And he continued to seek God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding through the vision of God. And as long as he sought Yahweh, God made him succeed. Nope. There are something else we'll notice, that you will notice if you read this portion of history. There were a lot of people named Zechariah, several, and it's very easy to get them confused. It was a very common name. The prophet Zechariah actually wrote after the exile and return. So this is not that guy. But he was a prophet. He had understanding through the vision of God. And he was a counselor to Uzziah throughout his reign. And as long as Uzziah sought Yahweh, it says, he made him succeed. So a little bit of foreshadowing there, an implication that at one point in his life, he didn't do as well. Then he went out and fought against the Philistines and broke down the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod. And he built cities in the area of Ashdod and among the Philistines. And God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians who lived in Gerbal and the Meunites. Not sure how to say that. Meunites. The Ammonites also gave tribute to Uzziah, and his fame extended to the border of Egypt, for he became very strong. And it's starting to become a pattern with these kings near the beginning of their reign. God gives them strength and victory over their enemies and a resulting peace. And then as they become strong, as they become secure in their reign, they start to drift. Uzziah took far longer to drift than most. Mm-hmm. Yeah, even Saul, even David himself, when they felt complacent, when they felt like this is it, I've arrived, it's not a struggle anymore, that's when things start to slip. And that's a very good warning for us to take away from the lives of the kings, that we don't start needing God less when we reach that point. It's a point to be very fearful and to pursue him even more wholeheartedly, to bring us on from that point to greater things. Sometimes complacency, comfort is our greatest danger, much more dangerous than any of the enemies that we encounter from outside. But Uzziah's heart was lifted up. He was a good king, and he knew he was a good king. He had a relationship with God, and what we see in him is a little bit different from what we see in a lot of other kings. They were proud of their militaries, they were proud of their political success. Uzziah was spiritually proud. He was proud of his relationship with God, and that pride led him into disobedience to God. In verse 16 of chapter 26, after talking about all of his strength and success, it says this: "But when he became strong, his heart was so proud that he acted corruptly." Literally, his heart was lifted up, and so he acted corruptly. "And he was unfaithful to Yahweh his God. And he entered the temple of Yahweh to burn incense on the altar of incense." So his sin was not going away from God to idols. It was having such an inflated idea of his relationship with God, a familiarity with God that would allow him to have this right to act as a priest and to try to personally take over the religious system of Israel. Then Azariah the priest, in verse 17, entered after him, and with him 80 priests of Yahweh, men of valor. Probably just everyone who was on staff at that moment, came in and confronted the king. They stood against Uzziah the king and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to Yahweh, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are set apart as holy to burn incense. Get out of the sanctuary, for you have been unfaithful and will have no honor from Yahweh God." But Uzziah, with a censer in his hand for burning incense, was enraged. And while he was enraged with the priests, the leprosy broke out on his forehead before the priests in the house of Yahweh, beside the altar of incense. So this is not in the most holy place, but in the holy place, the place where only priests were supposed to go in. And as we've seen before, the altar of incense was right in front of the curtain that separated them from the Ark of the Covenant. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked at him, and behold, he was leprous on his forehead. And they hurried him out of there, and he himself also hastened to get out, because Yahweh had smitten him. So King Uzziah was a leper to the day of his death, and he lived in a separate house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of Yahweh. And Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So there's a very good chance that not all of those 52 years when he was king, he was actually reigning. And this is one of a few times, and they can seem like contradictions sometimes. If you're just reading casually and aren't aware that this happened, but his son began reigning before he stopped reigning, before he died. So there's some overlap in the numbers here. So King Uzziah was still technically king, but living as a leper, not actually ruling. Jotham, his son, was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first to last, the prophet Isaiah, the son of Amos, has written. So Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of the grave which belonged to the kings, for they said, "He is a leper." And Jotham, his son, became king in his place. So he was buried in a field that belonged to the kings. He wasn't buried in the main system of tombs. He was separated because he is a leper, not because he was disgraced nearly as badly as some of these others were. And the most encouraging thing about Uzziah probably is the influence he was able to have on his son. When we read about Jotham, we know very little about Jotham. It's a very short section. But Jotham basically did everything right that Uzziah had done without doing the one mistake that his father had made. But as I mentioned, at King Uzziah's death in that year, we saw him mentioned. Isaiah, the son of Amos, wrote the Acts of Uzziah, a record of Uzziah's reign, which apparently the writer of Second Chronicles drew from as a source. So we probably have some of those words that Isaiah wrote in this chapter. But the full record, of course, we don't have. It's not part of the book of Isaiah. The book of Isaiah starts really right after that point. And it records a lot of historical events in the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah, but not before that point. And Isaiah was told after this point, after Uzziah's death, that the people he was going to be going to and preaching to were going to be unable to hear and accept his message, that they had essentially already been judged. Jotham is the next in line. As I mentioned before, he learned from his father's success and his failure. Just the first two verses of 2 Chronicles 27 say, Jotham was 25 years old when he became king, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Jerusha, the daughter of Zadok. And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that his father Uzziah had done. However, he did not enter the temple of Yahweh. But the people continued acting corruptly. He built the upper gate of the house of Yahweh, and he built extensively the wall of Ophel. He built cities in the hill country of Judah. He built fortresses and towers on the wooded hills. He fought with the sons of Ammon a bit. And he was strong. Verse 6, Jotham became strong because he established his ways before Yahweh his God. And he had a very short reign, relatively. He was 25 years old when he became king in verse 8, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And it's not perfectly clear. I mean, somebody I'm sure has done the math and added everything up and could tell us, but it's not clear from the passage itself whether those include the years that he co-reigned with his father or just the years after that. But he slept with his fathers. They buried him in the city of David, and Ahaz, his son, became king in his place. So he was a good king, but didn't really reign long enough or do anything noteworthy enough to be influential in the way that somebody like Hezekiah did. Ahaz was only the second truly bad king. The first one was the one before Joash. I forgot his name. Sorry. But yeah, Ahab's son-in-law, the one who married Ahab's daughter, he was a piece of work. Ahaz had far less excuse. He wasn't related to anyone who led him astray. He led himself astray. Just decided on his own that he wanted nothing to do with the religion of his father and grandfather. Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king at the beginning of chapter 28. And he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the sight of Yahweh, as David his father had done. But he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel. He also made molten images for the Baals. Moreover, he offered offerings in smoke in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and burned his sons in the fire, according to the abominations of the nations whom Yahweh had dispossessed from before the sons of Israel. He also sacrificed and offered offerings in smoke on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. And according to what we know from Jewish tradition, the practice was that there was a metal statue of Molech. It was the god that they did this with, and they would light a fire under that statue, make it incredibly hot, and then as drums and other instruments drowned out the sound of cries, they would put the child being sacrificed in the arm of Molech, and from the heat of the statue, the child would burn to death. So just really sick stuff, very horrible religion. And as I said, Ahaz adopted this style of worship, began serving these gods without any kind of influence to do so. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, it says. And because of this, in verse 5, Yahweh his God gave him into the hand of the king of Aram. Remember, Aram is the nation above the northern kingdom of Israel. So Aram came south and struck him and carried away from him a great number of captives and brought them to Damascus, the capital of Aram, or Syria. And he was also given into the hand of the king of Israel, who struck him with a great slaughter. Indeed, Pekah, the son of Remaliah, killed in Judah 1,200,000 in one day, all men of valor, because they had forsaken Yahweh, the God of their fathers. And a lot of people were taken captive by the northern kingdom. They brought them north into Israel. But a prophet in the northern kingdom named Oded, in verse 9, he talks to them and says that God's already angry with you, basically. Yes, he's punishing them as well, but you don't need to compound your problems by inciting his wrath even more. Let these people go, let them return back to their homeland. And rather surprisingly, they did. The army gave the people food, clothing, everything they needed, and escorted them south to Jericho and left them there and went back home. So Ahaz has suffered defeats already by both Aram and Israel. And it brings us to what we went over in December, which is recorded in the book of Isaiah, the alliance that there was between Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, and the king of Aram. They came together against Jerusalem with the intention of killing Ahaz and putting their own king in his place. Isaiah, if you remember from Isaiah chapters 7, he counseled Ahaz not to go to the king of Assyria for help, which is what he was considering doing, but to trust in God instead. Ahaz didn't listen. He sent to Assyria, and they did help him, but there's Isaiah talking to Ahaz with his son there with him. So in verse 16, at that time, King Ahaz sent to the kings of Assyria for help. But down in verses 20 and 21, so Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, came against him and distressed him instead of strengthening him. So he took care of his enemies, but didn't benefit Judah in any way. Although Ahaz took a portion out of the house of Yahweh and out of the house of the kings and of the princes and gave it to the king of Assyria did not help him. So he began to have trouble with Assyria now instead of the trouble he had. The Assyrians began treating Judah as a vassal kingdom, as a kingdom that owed them tribute because they had helped them, and began enforcing that. Verse 22, now in the time of his distress, this same King Ahaz became even more unfaithful to Yahweh. Indeed, he sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, which had struck him. And he said, because the gods of the kings of Aram helped them, I will sacrifice to them that they may help me. But they became the stumbling of him and all Israel. Ahaz gathered together the utensils of the house of God. Then he cut the utensils of the house of God in pieces, and he closed the doors of the house of Yahweh, and made altars for himself in every corner of Jerusalem. So he literally closed the temple and said, we're not going to worship Yahweh anymore. We're going to make new altars, worship other gods. And saw that as the solution to his problems that he was having with these other nations. Now in each and every city of Judah, he made high places to offer offerings in smoke to other gods, and provoked Yahweh, the God of his fathers, to anger. And the rest of his acts and all his ways from first to last, behold, they are written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. So Ahaz slept with his fathers, and they buried him in the city, in Jerusalem, for they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. And Hezekiah, his son, became king in his place. And by implication, it seems the first thing Hezekiah did when he became king after his father died was make the decision, no, we are not going to bury my father in the tombs of the kings, because he was an idolater. Hezekiah rebelled against his father as well in the way that Ahaz had. He rebelled the other way, and he rebelled fiercely. Hezekiah became king when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did what was right in the sight of Yahweh, according to all that David his father had done. And that's a very unusual thing for us to hear. Most of the, assessments we've heard, the king has done right, but not quite as well as David. David is the benchmark. He's the standard. Hezekiah went all the way up and hit that standard himself. He was the same kind of king that David was. He had the same passion for God. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of Yahweh and repaired them. So immediately, as soon as he had power, he began undoing what his father had done. And he brought the priests and the Levites and gathered them into the square on the east. Then he said to them, "Listen to me, O Levites. Set yourselves apart now as holy, and set apart as holy the house of Yahweh, the God of your fathers, and bring out the impurity from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful and have done what is evil in the sight of Yahweh our God, and have forsaken him and turned their faces away from the dwelling place of Yahweh, and have turned their backs." Shut the doors and all that. He describes what they've done and what now he is going to do in response. He resets up the system of worship that they had. And it becomes very clear at this point. It's earlier, you can guess it as well, but there is some definite priestly influence in this book. It's very, very possible that they had records from the priests themselves, temple records, to work with when writing Second Chronicles. And a lot of people believe that the book of Chronicles was written by somebody who was a priest, or at least a member of the tribe of Levi, somebody who cares very much about temple sacrifices, temple rituals, the relationship between the kings and the priests. And he goes on for quite a while in detail describing the offerings that Hezekiah made, that the people brought, the purification rites they went through. And this is really special, some of the things that Hezekiah did. 34 through 30 of that same chapter. So, 29:34 through 30, verse 3. That makes more sense. It says, "But the priests were too few." In chapter 29, verse 34, the priests were too few, so that they were unable to skin all the burnt offerings that were brought as part of this rededication ceremony. Therefore, their brothers, the Levites, helped them until the work was completed and until other priests had set apart themselves as holy. For the Levites were more upright of heart to set themselves apart as holy than the priests. So apparently even among the priests, there were people who just morally weren't qualified, that Hezekiah wouldn't allow to participate in this. And they had to bring in Levites, people who weren't technically priests, but whose hearts were right before God, to assist in the great number of animals to be sacrificed. And Hezekiah is also compared in this to Solomon. This kind of thing had not happened since Solomon's day, this extravagance in worshiping Yahweh. There were also many burnt offerings with the fat of the peace offerings, and with the drink offerings for the burnt offerings. Thus the service of the house of Yahweh was established again. Then Hezekiah and all the people were glad over what God had prepared for the people, because the thing came about suddenly. It was a night and day difference when Hezekiah took over. And beginning of chapter 30, "And Hezekiah sent to all Israel and Judah, and wrote letters also to Ephraim and Manasseh." So Ephraim and Manasseh, the tribes of Joseph, they are representative of the northern kingdom. So he sent messages through the northern kingdom as well as the south, that they should come to the house of Yahweh at Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover to Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the king and his princes and all the assembly of Jerusalem had taken counsel to celebrate the Passover in the second month. Since they could not celebrate it at that time, because the priests had not set themselves apart as holy in sufficient numbers, nor had the people been gathered to Jerusalem. So, because of the incredible haste, Hezekiah is not willing to wait until the next year to celebrate the Passover correctly, as God has told them to do it. He wants to do it right now this year, but there weren't enough priests yet who had been consecrated. The people needed time to get there, so they made the decision together to delay the celebration of the Passover by 1 month, to give people time to assemble. Thus the thing was right in the eyes of the king and in the eyes of all the assembly. So a few times through here, and this isn't the last time, the normal structure, the normal way of doing things that was set down in the law is put aside or altered for practical reasons. But the hearts of the people are right. So couriers passed in verse 10. Couriers passed from city to city through the country of Ephraim and Manasseh, and as far as Zebulun. But they were laughing them to scorn and mocking them. Nevertheless, some men of Asher, Manasseh, and Zebulun humbled themselves and came to Jerusalem. The hand of God was also on Judah to give them one heart to do what the king and the princes commanded by the word of Yahweh. And some of the people who came, again, everything was incredibly rushed. This was unfamiliar. A lot of the laws and regulations were not common knowledge. And they began to offer sacrifices in their passion, in their religious zeal, without purifying themselves first, without being, strictly speaking, ready to do so. Some people hadn't purified themselves for the feast, so the Levites had to come and help them to sacrifice their lambs. In the Passover, everybody would sacrifice their own lamb for their household. Because people weren't ritually clean, the Levites had to step in and help with that. And Hezekiah prays on behalf of the people. Hezekiah prayed for them at the end of verse 18, saying, "May Yahweh, who is good, atone for everyone who prepares his heart to seek God. Yahweh, the God of his fathers, though not according to the rules of cleansing of the sanctuary." So Yahweh heard Hezekiah and healed the people, those who had prepared their hearts to seek God. God was able to overlook the fact that they had failed to prepare their bodies, that they had failed to ritualistically prepare for this sacrifice. And so Christ wasn't the first one to point out that God cares more about the heart than the externals of worship. And he definitely blessed Hezekiah's heart and Hezekiah's desire to serve him and to lead the people in this revival. But the feast was enormously grand, like nothing that had happened in the land, as I said, since the time of Solomon. There was, after this, a mass destruction of idols, not just Hezekiah, but the people who had been at the Passover when they went back through Israel. As they went, tore down pagan shrines and destroyed idols everywhere they went. So throughout the land, there was this huge overthrow of pagan worship. And if you noticed in the previous picture, what they were tearing down there in the temple was the bronze serpent. The bronze serpent had been worshipped, the one that Moses had made in the wilderness. It had become an idol for the Israelites, and they had been burning incense to it. So Hezekiah took it down and destroyed it. And this brings us up to the fall of Samaria, and that's where we're going to start next week. The king of Assyria came south, destroyed the northern kingdom, and continued south into Judah as well. And we're going to see what transpired next week. Any questions before we close? All right. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that in every time you have had a people who have a genuine passion for you, who want to serve you in spite of everything that they see around them, everything they're used to, everything they've been taught, who recognize that following you it demands wholehearted devotion. It demands that we hold nothing back. Help us to follow their example, to follow you in that way, to give you the honor you deserve, to recognize that our lives belong to you, and to truly please you in everything we do this week and as we worship you this morning. In Jesus' name, amen.